The desert night was heavy with silence, broken only by the crunch of boots pressing into dust and the faint hum of distant generators somewhere deep inside the valley. The SEAL team moved like shadows across the broken terrain, weapons up, scanning every ridge and hollow for signs of movement. Their mission had been simple on paper: exfiltrate a captured asset from an insurgent stronghold tucked between cliffs and ravines. But as every man on the team knew, simple on paper rarely survived contact with reality. Lieutenant Hawkins led from the front, his night vision lenses glowing faintly as he raised a clenched fist to halt the column. The men froze instantly, dropping into the sand, rifles steady. A faint glimmer of metal caught his eye in the distance, the reflection of a moonbeam off something that shouldn't be there. He whispered into his comms, voice barely above a breath. "Tripwire. They're waiting for us." A quiet curse hissed through the channel, but the team adjusted without hesitation, peeling right and hugging the shadows of the rocks, every muscle wound tight. The valley seemed to breathe with danger. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, the hostage waited, an intelligence officer who had been ambushed 2 weeks earlier, dragged into captivity, and used as bait for exactly this kind of rescue attempt. The SEALs knew the odds were ugly. Satellite imagery had already shown anti-air emplacements scattered along the ridgelines, meaning their exfil bird would only have seconds on the ground. Air cover was supposed to be the equalizer, the hammer to smash through resistance and keep insurgents' heads down. Tonight, however, nothing about the op felt equal. They reached the perimeter of the compound, a cluster of concrete bunkers dug into the rock face. A single guard sat smoking under a corrugated tin awning, his AK slung lazily over his shoulder. Hawkins raised 2 fingers, signaling for Ramirez and Cole to move. 2 suppressed shots cracked like whispers, and the man slumped without a sound. They dragged the body into the shadows, clearing the path to the entryway. The door creaked open and they slipped inside, the dark swallowing them whole. Inside smelled of diesel and sweat. Bare bulbs dangled from wires, casting uneven shadows across walls scrawled with slogans and bullet holes. Hawkins' heartbeat thudded in his ears as they crept down the hall, every corner cleared with surgical precision. Then came the muffled sob of a man. They found him in a locked room, beaten, pale, hands bound, but alive. Chief Daniels cut the restraints, whispering reassurance as he hauled the man up. The hostage's eyes, swollen but burning with desperation, darted toward the door. "They know you're here," he rasped. That was when the first burst of gunfire shredded the silence. Bullets hammered the wall above them, chips of concrete spraying into the room. The team reacted instantly, stacking in the doorway, returning fire down the corridor. The hostage cowered behind a metal desk as the SEALs unleashed controlled bursts, their suppressed rifles snapping like angry wasps. But for every target they dropped, more insurgents seemed to appear, flooding the hallways with shouts and muzzle flashes. "Hawkins, we need exfil now." Ramirez barked over the comms. Hawkins toggled his radio, calling it in. "Thunder 1, this is Viper Actual. Package secure, requesting immediate dust off. Hot LZ, repeat, hot LZ." The answer came back after a tense pause, static lacing the pilot's voice. "Viper, be advised, air cover's gone. Repeat, air cover is unavailable. You're on your own until further notice." Hawkins' stomach dropped like stone. Air cover gone? That meant no Apaches, no drones overhead, no safety net against the waves of fighters closing in on them. Without it, extraction turned into suicide. But hesitation wasn't an option. "Copy," Hawkins growled. "We'll make our way to Grid Bravo. Get that bird here on time or we're dead." He cut the comms and signaled the team forward. They burst back into the night under a hail of tracer fire, the valley lighting up with chaos. Insurgents fired from rooftops and ridges, RPGs streaking into the air with trails of smoke. The SEALs moved like ghosts, leapfrogging positions, firing short bursts to cover each other as they dragged the hostage toward the extraction zone. Sand kicked up around their boots as rounds smacked into the ground, and the air stank of cordite and burning fuel. Daniels went down hard, a round grazing his shoulder, but he snarled and pushed back to his feet, refusing to slow the pace. "Keep moving," Hawkins shouted, his voice drowned by the roar of gunfire. They dove behind a rock outcrop, breath heaving, reloading mags with shaking hands. Every man's face glistened with sweat, eyes burning with the knowledge that without air support, their odds of surviving the next 10 minutes were shrinking fast. The hostage was barely on his feet, his weight dragging on Daniels and Cole as they half-carried him along. Over the ridge, headlights flared, technical trucks roaring into the valley, heavy machine guns mounted in their beds. Hawkins' gut clenched. They were being corralled, cut off. He keyed the radio again, desperation sharpening his tone. Thunder 1, where the hell is my bird? We are pinned, I say again, pinned. Air cover is gone, we need anything you can throw at us. The reply was broken by static but clear enough. Negative, Viper. No assets cleared in your AO. You're gonna have to fight your way through. The line went dead. For a moment, despair threatened to crush him. But then he saw his men, eyes locked on him, waiting for orders, trusting him to find a way through. He steadied his breathing, forcing the fear down. We're not dying in this canyon, he said firmly. We hold this line, then we push. Move on my mark. Tracer fire lit the night like red comets as the insurgents advanced. The SEALs answered with disciplined fury, their rifles barking, grenades thumping, smoke hissing into the air. Shadows danced across the cliffs as explosions rocked the ground. Hawkins fired until his rifle clicked empty, then slammed in a fresh mag, his ears ringing. The technical trucks opened up with their heavy guns, rounds tearing through stone, showering the team with shards. The ground felt like it was shaking apart and the hostage screamed, covering his head. Hawkins thought bitterly of the promise of air support, of the safety net ripped away. If no miracle came, they were already dead men walking. And then through the chaos came a sound, low at first like distant thunder. A rumble that grew into a roar, deeper and harsher than any rotor wash or jet whine. Every man froze, ears straining. Hawkins' heart leapt. He knew that sound. The insurgents didn't realize at first, but the SEALs did. A jet engine, savage and guttural, cutting through the night like a predator's growl. The sound swelled, closer now, unmistakable. And then it broke over the ridgeline with a scream, the unmistakable snarl of a Gu-8 Avenger cannon mounted beneath the nose of an A-10 Warthog. The insurgents faltered, heads tilting upward just as the sky ripped open in fire. The Warthog screamed in low, its silhouette blotting out the stars, and the night turned to daylight as streams of 30mm rounds poured down, tearing technicals to shreds, exploding fuel drums, vaporizing entire lines of fighters and sprays of dirt and flame. The cannon's growl rolled across the valley, shaking the ground, drowning out even the thunder of battle. For the first time all night, Hawkins felt the tide turn. A savage grin cracked his face as he shouted into the comms. Boys, looks like we've got our cover after all. The A-10's scream rolled across the canyon like a war god announcing judgment, and the effect on the insurgents was immediate and devastating. The fighters who moments before had pressed forward with zeal now scattered in every direction, some diving behind boulders, others abandoning their technicals entirely as streams of armor-piercing shells shredded vehicles into molten fragments. The air smelled of burning fuel and scorched metal, thick plumes of smoke clawing upward as the Warthog banked hard, pulling into a wide arc above the valley. Its engines thundered, and for a moment all eyes, friend and foe alike, followed its flight path. Hawkins knew it wasn't just a machine. To the men on the ground, that ugly beast with its stubby wings and sharkish nose was salvation incarnate. His pulse steadied even as he ducked behind cover, dragging the hostage down with him as more explosions shook the ground. Hold your fire. Hawkins barked into the comms. Let her work. The Gu-8 roared again, a solid wall of sound that drowned out everything, each round a tungsten sledgehammer dropping from the sky. Hawkins peeked over the rock just long enough to see one of the technical trucks erupt into a fireball. The gunner ripped apart before he had a chance to scream. Fighters scrambled like ants under a magnifying glass, spraying their rifles wildly at the sky as though bullets could swat down the armored angel above them. The A-10 didn't flinch. It dove low, almost skimming the ridge before pulling up sharply and releasing a pair of rockets. The ground convulsed as warheads tore through a bunker entrance, sending insurgents tumbling out, their bodies ragdolling under the force. The shockwave rattled Hawkins' teeth, but the grin never left his face. The tide was shifting, but he knew they couldn't rely on the plane alone. The Warthog was their hammer, but they still had to be the knife. Move, move, move. Hawkins ordered, rising from cover and signaling the team forward. The SEALs surged across the open stretch, weaving through the chaos as dirt geysered from impacts nearby. Cole and Ramirez fired controlled bursts to keep heads down, while Daniels and Price half-dragged the hostage forward, his legs barely cooperating after weeks of captivity. Hawkins stayed at the center, directing fire, keeping the team tight. His radio crackled, the voice of the A-10 pilot cutting through the static. Viper Actual, this is Hog 1. You boys look like you needed a hand. Hawkins laughed, breathless even in the middle of hell. You're damn right we do. Keep painting targets, we're pushing to exfil. Copy that, the pilot answered calmly. I've got plenty of love to share. Mark targets with IR if you need close runs. The confidence in that voice was like oxygen, and Hawkins felt strength return to his limbs. The valley wasn't silent though. For every truck obliterated, more insurgents poured out from caves and dugouts, rallying under the hammer of their commander's shouts. Mortar tubes thumped in the distance, shells arcing overhead and crashing into the dirt just yards away. Shrapnel hissed through the air, embedding into rock and flesh alike. Ramirez cursed as a fragment tore a line across his cheek, blood mixing with sweat, but he never stopped firing. The SEALs pushed toward the extraction zone, their progress measured in heartbeats and gunshots. Hawkins scanned constantly, his rifle steady, his mind calculating angles and timing with icy precision. He keyed his mic Hog 1 Grid Delta 7. Give me fire on that mortar nest. A moment later the Warthog screamed past again, its cannon spitting fury into the ridgeline. The mortar crew vanished in a storm of fire and dust, their weapon reduced to twisted debris. The hostage stumbled again, collapsing to his knees. Daniels snarled, hauling him upright by sheer force. Come on buddy, you don't get to quit now. His voice was rough but steady, a lifeline dragging the broken man forward. Hawkins caught a glimpse of Daniel's shoulder wound, blood soaking through the bandage, spreading dark across his camo. The man was running on fumes, but his eyes burned with the same refusal that drove them all. Hawkins pressed a hand briefly to his back as they pushed on. We're almost there, Chief. Just a little more. The extraction zone was less than half a click away now, a flat stretch of dirt where the bird could land, but it felt like crossing an ocean under fire. Every step forward was contested, every second a gamble against death. Above them the A-10 wheeled again, tracing wide loops in the sky like a hawk circling prey. Its engines roared as it dove once more, releasing flares that lit the sky like fireworks. Surface-to-air missiles streaked upward from hidden launchers, only to be fooled by the brilliant heat signatures, detonating harmlessly in midair. Hawkins felt his stomach twist. The enemy was better prepared than intel had warned. They hadn't just laid traps for SEALs, they'd set a net for aircraft too. That meant Hog 1 was in danger every second he stayed low. Hog 1, watch your skies, Hawkins warned. They've got SAMs out there. The pilot's voice came back calm as ever, almost cocky. Roger that, Viper. Wouldn't be the first time somebody tried to swat me. Keep moving, I'll clear your lane. Hawkins shook his head, admiration threading through his urgency. Those Warthog pilots were a breed apart, fearless, stubborn, and deadly precise. Gunfire intensified as the SEALs rounded another outcrop. Insurgents swarmed across the ridge, silhouetted against the firelit smoke, shouting war cries as they opened up. Hawkins dropped one with a single shot to the chest, then another with a burst that spun the fighter backward. Cole lobbed a grenade, the explosion throwing bodies and dirt skyward in a violent bloom. The hostage screamed again, but Daniels shoved him forward, forcing his legs to move. The team advanced like a machine, each man covering the next, every shot purposeful, every motion practiced from years of training for exactly this hell. But even machines wore down, and Hawkins could see the exhaustion etching itself into their movements, the weight of endless combat dragging at their limbs. Time was their enemy now as much as the men firing at them. Then the ground shook with the heaviest blast yet. An RPG slammed into the rock wall just feet from Ramirez, throwing him hard onto his back. Dust clouded the air, rocks raining down. Hawkins dove through the haze, grabbing his man by the harness, dragging him upright. Ramirez coughed blood but waved him off, staggering to his feet with weapon still in hand. I'm good, LT. I'm good. Hawkins clapped his helmet once and shoved him forward. The extraction zone was close now, he could almost smell the rotor wash in his imagination. He toggled his comms again. Thunder 1 Viper actual. We're almost at Bravo. Get that bird inbound now. The reply came after a tense pause. Viper, Thunder 1. Birds lifting. EDA 2 mics. Hold your ground. 2 minutes. They just had to survive 2 more minutes. But the enemy knew it too. From the northern ridge, headlights flared again. Another convoy of technicals roared into the valley, dust plumes trailing behind, machine guns already chattering. Hawkins' chest tightened. They didn't have ammo for another long fight and their bird was still out. He looked up, praying silently for that brutal scream again. And as if answering, the A-10 banked out of the smoke, dropping low, its cannon already spinning up. The sound came, that bone-deep growl, and the world exploded as 30mm shells ripped through the convoy, detonating trucks into burning husks. The night blazed with orange fireballs, shockwaves slamming against the SEALs' chests. Hawkins threw up an arm against the heat as shrapnel peppered the ground around them. When he looked back, the convoy was gone, reduced to wreckage, the survivors scattering into the desert. For a heartbeat, silence followed, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the roar of the A-10 circling overhead. The valley burned like a furnace, flames rising high enough to lick the cliff faces, black smoke spiraling into the night sky and blotting out the stars. Hawkins crouched low, chest heaving, rifle tight in his grip as he scanned the destruction through his NVGs. Bodies and wreckage littered the dirt, smoldering remains of trucks glowing hot like molten coals. The A-10 circled above, its engines howling like some relentless predator, banking wide arcs to keep watch over the men below. For the first time since the mission had gone sideways, Hawkins felt the faint flicker of something dangerously close to hope. But he knew better than to let it root too deep. Hope could get a man killed just as easily as fear. He toggled his comms. Thunder 1, status on our bird? The reply came fast, rotors audible even through static. Viper bird is inbound. 90 seconds. Hold that ground, we're coming in hot. 90 seconds. Hawkins clenched his jaw, eyes sweeping the ridgeline. 90 seconds was forever in a firefight. Across the team, the men shifted, reloading mags, checking the hostage's condition. Daniel's shoulder wound had soaked through again, blood dark against his camo, but he stayed upright, one massive hand locked around the hostage's harness to keep him moving. Ramirez coughed harshly, spitting red into the dirt, but gave a thumbs up when Hawkins' eyes met his. These men were running on grit alone, bodies battered, ammo dwindling, but none of them showed an ounce of quit. Hawkins crouched low, listening. The gunfire had faded, but he knew it wasn't over. It never was. The enemy wasn't routed, just regrouping, and when they came again it would be with everything they had left. He could feel it in his bones, the tension in the night thick as oil. The sound of rotors grew, faint at first, then swelling into a heavy chop that rattled in his chest. The exfil bird was close. Hawkins felt relief touch him, quick and fleeting, before a flash lit the ridge. He didn't even need to think. His instincts screamed before his brain caught up. Incoming. An RPG streaked out of the smoke, trailing fire, slamming into the dirt less than 20 yards from their position. The blast punched the breath from his lungs, throwing dust and shards of rock into the air. The team dropped flat, ears ringing while the hostage shrieked and curled tight. More shouts echoed from the ridge, gunfire spitting down in wild, furious bursts. The insurgents weren't done. They were throwing everything at keeping the SEALs from leaving alive. Hawkins raised his rifle and fired back, controlled, deliberate, his rounds punching through shadows on the ridge. Around him, the team answered in kind, their fire a steady rhythm despite exhaustion. The rotors were close now, thunder beating through the smoke as the MH-60 dropped into the valley, floodlights cutting through the haze. Its door guns opened up immediately, .50 cal fire ripping into the ridges, chewing rock and flesh alike into dust. The ground shook as if giants were stomping across it. The SEALs rose as one, dragging the hostage upright, sprinting toward the descending bird. Hawkins fired over his shoulder as he ran, cutting down a fighter who broke from cover with a grenade in hand. The man crumpled, the grenade detonating harmlessly against the far wall. The A-10 screamed again, diving low to strafe another line of fighters charging down from the northern ridge, its 30mm cannon pounding the earth in precise, merciless bursts. Hawkins felt the concussion in his chest as dirt and fire leapt skyward, scattering bodies in the chaos. The Warthog's run cleared the path, but the insurgents were relentless, still firing, still chasing even as the helicopter settled onto the dirt with a blast of rotor wash. Go, go, go! Hawkins roared, waving the men forward. Cole and Ramirez hustled the hostage toward the open ramp, bullets sparking against the bird's armored skin as the gunners laid down covering fire. Daniel stumbled, his shoulder finally giving, but Hawkins grabbed his vest and hauled him upright, half carrying him the last stretch. The team piled onto the bird, the crew pulling them inside, shoving the hostage against the bulkhead as medics scrambled forward. Hawkins was the last up the ramp, firing his rifle until the final second before yanking himself aboard. The ramp slammed shut, the helicopter lifting even as rounds peppered the dirt below. For a heartbeat it felt like they had made it. But then the alarm went off, shrill, piercing, the missile warning system screaming through the cabin. "Missile lock," the crew chief shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of rotors and gunfire. Hawkins' blood went cold as he turned toward the open side door, just in time to see the contrail streaking toward them from the ridge. The pilot yanked the stick hard, the bird banking violently, flares ejecting in blazing arcs that lit the night. The missile swerved, drawn by the heat, detonating in a brilliant fireball just yards off their tail. The shockwave slammed into the chopper, rattling every bolt, tossing the men against their harnesses. Hawkins gritted his teeth, gripping the webbing above his seat. The pilot fought the controls, dragging the bird level again, rotors straining. Hold on, the crew chief bellowed. The chopper clawed for altitude, engines screaming as more tracer fire lit the night from below. The A-10 was already there. Hawkins craned his neck to see it roll into another pass, releasing flares of its own as it strafed the launch site with unrelenting fury. The SAM position vanished in fire, the cliff collapsing under the barrage. The Warthog banked sharply, cutting across the valley in a protective arc around the helicopter. Hawkins felt his chest loosen for the first time all night, his eyes fixed on the plane as if willing it to stay with them. The pilot's voice came through the comms, calm as ever. Viper actual, Hog 1. You're clear. Get your boys home. Hawkins exhaled slowly, a bitter laugh catching in his throat. Roger that, Hog 1. Couldn't have done it without you. The helicopter gained altitude, climbing above the smoke and chaos, the valley shrinking beneath them. Through the open door, Hawkins could see the fires raging, the wreckage of trucks still smoldering, the enemy scattering like ants underfoot. He leaned back against the bulkhead, lungs burning, muscles shaking from exhaustion. Daniels slumped beside him, pale and sweating, clutching his shoulder while a medic worked quickly to stem the bleeding. Ramirez lay flat, coughing blood, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts, but his eyes still burned with the stubborn fire of survival. The hostage sat against the wall, trembling, his eyes wild, whispering something over and over that Hawkins couldn't hear. Hawkins' gaze drifted to his men, his brothers, and he felt that familiar mixture of pride and guilt. They had pulled off the impossible, but at a cost none of them would fully understand until later. The pilot's voice filled the cabin, steady but urgent. We're not out of the woods yet. Strap in, we've got a long flight and more bad guys out there with toys. Hawkins nodded grimly, strapping his harness tighter, weapon still close at hand. The A-10 continued to circle below, covering their ascent, its engines rumbling like a guardian spirit refusing to leave until the job was truly done. Hawkins stared out into the night, sweat drying cold on his skin, heart still hammering in his chest. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time in hours, survival felt like more than a fading hope. It felt possible. He closed his eyes briefly, the roar of the engines filling his ears, and thought of one truth he knew with certainty. If not for that screaming warthog and the man flying it, they'd all be nothing but names on a memorial wall. The MH-60 carved through the night sky, rotors chopping the air with a relentless rhythm, the cabin vibrating like a living beast straining against gravity. Hawkins sat strapped in against the bulkhead, helmet tilted back as he tried to steady his breathing. The adrenaline still pounded through his veins, but exhaustion was starting to sink its claws into him, turning his limbs heavy and sluggish. Across from him, Daniels bit down hard on a piece of gauze as the medic wrapped his shoulder, blood already soaking another layer of bandages. Ramirez lay propped against the sidewall, pale and clammy, lips flecked with red as he forced shallow breaths through clenched teeth. Cole sat beside him, one hand gripping his brother-in-arm's shoulder, silent but steady, eyes fixed outward as if sheer vigilance could shield them all. The hostage shivered uncontrollably, his face ghost pale, mumbling prayers in a hoarse whisper, eyes darting to every vibration in the air. Hawkins pulled his gaze to the open door, staring past the gunner into the vast black spread of desert below. Fire still flickered across the valley, glowing like angry embers in the dark, smoke rising in ghostly plumes that twisted into the wind. Beyond, the landscape was a jagged sprawl of ridges and canyons, harsh terrain where shadows hid threats at every turn. He keyed his comms. Thunder 1, what's our route? The pilot's voice came back tight, strained by the task of threading their steel bird through hostile skies. We're cutting north by northwest, low and fast. Ground intel says enemy reinforcements are mobilizing. We've got to skirt their lines or we're done. Hawkins clenched his jaw. Reinforcements meant fresh fighters, vehicles, and missiles, all chasing them into the night. He turned his head skyward, straining to catch the sound of Hog 1, and there it was, that low, guttural growl echoing faintly against the heavens. The A-10 was still there keeping watch. The crew chief leaned in, shouting above the din, "Lieutenant, we've got fuel for about 40 minutes before we have to hit the tanker. If we take too many detours, we're pushing the limits." Hawkins gave a grim nod. "Then we don't detour. We cut through." It was a gamble, but every second they lingered over enemy territory meant another chance for the insurgents to mass and strike. Better to bleed through the middle than crawl along the edges and get boxed in. The decision weighed heavy, but he trusted his gut, and he trusted the pilot above them, that ugly angel in the sky. Hog 1 Viper actual. We're moving northwest, cutting across enemy lines. We'll need you on overwatch. The reply came cool and confident. Copy Viper. I'll carve the path. Stay low and keep tight. The words had barely left the radio when the first tracers lit up the sky ahead. A ridge ahead flickered with muzzle flashes, heavy machine guns raking the air as insurgents opened up with everything they had. The helicopter swerved hard, banking low, rotor wash kicking sand into spirals as rounds tore past. The door gunner leaned into his weapon, returning fire in long, thunderous bursts that stitched the ridge with fire. Sparks showered into the night as rounds clanged off rock, and still the enemy pressed. Then came the scream, the A-10 diving from nowhere, cannon thundering in rolling bursts. The ridge exploded into shards and smoke, gun nests shredded under the hail. The Warthog didn't just strafe, it annihilated, carving whole swaths of earth apart until nothing moved but falling debris. The crew cheered over the intercom, voices ragged with relief, but Hawkins didn't cheer. He knew there'd be more. There was always more. The helicopter surged forward, hugging the terrain, weaving through valleys and skimming ridges as the pilot pushed the machine to its limits. Hawkins glanced again at his men. Daniel's face had gone gray, sweat dripping down his jaw, but he kept his eyes open, refusing to falter. Ramirez had passed into a half-conscious haze, his breath shallow, his hand twitching whenever the chopper jolted. Cole never left his side, murmuring something only Ramirez could hear, his eyes still burning outward with that cold warrior's focus. Hawkins felt the weight of their lives pressing on him, each man's survival chained to his decisions. He tightened his grip on his rifle, reminding himself that the mission wasn't over until they were on safe ground. Ahead, the terrain opened into a wide basin, jagged cliffs circling the perimeter like teeth. It should have been empty. Instead, headlights dotted the floor, a convoy moving fast, technical trucks and APCs, their weapons already swinging skyward. Hawkins' stomach dropped. They'd walked straight into another net. Contact front, the crew chief shouted. The pilot banked hard, pulling the chopper low, but the insurgents were ready. RPG trails lit the night, streaking upward like angry comets. The MH-60 lurched as one rocket detonated close off the nose, rocking the bird violently. Flares, flares, the pilot barked, and blazing suns spat from the sides, drawing 2 missiles into harmless bursts. But there were too many launchers, too many guns. They were boxed in and Hawkins knew it. He slammed the comms. Hog 1 front grid, heavy armor and launchers. We need you now. The reply came with the snarl of turbines overhead. The 8-10 descended like Judgment Day, nose dipping, cannon blazing. The sound was deafening, a chainsaw tearing through the night, every burst shaking the sky. Rounds tore into the convoy, trucks bursting into fireballs, APCs splitting apart as their fuel ignited. The ground erupted with shock waves, men scattering in blind panic as their vehicles disintegrated around them. The helicopter threaded through the chaos, banking hard as the A-10 shredded everything in its path, the pilot's precision carving a corridor of death straight through the ambush. Hawkins watched through the open door, awe mixing with relief as enemy fire vanished under a curtain of explosions. The Warthog banked again, climbing, its silhouette sharp against the fiery backdrop, flares spitting from its tail as more SAMs clawed for it and failed. The chopper roared out of the basin, engines screaming as the pilot pushed it into open sky. For a moment, silence returned, broken only by the hum of rotors and the distant thunder of Hog 1 circling above. Hawkins sagged against the bulkhead, his body finally beginning to register the toll. His ears rang, his eyes burned, every muscle screamed with fatigue, but he forced himself upright, scanning the horizon. They weren't out yet. He knew the enemy would chase until they reached friendly airspace, and every mile between was another gauntlet. He looked to his men again. Daniels was slipping toward unconsciousness now, head lolling against the wall as the medic worked furiously to keep him stable. Ramirez's breaths had grown weaker, his chest barely lifting with each one, while Cole's jaw clenched tight, holding his brother's hand like he could tether him to life by sheer force. Hawkins swallowed hard, the guilt gnawing at him. He was responsible for all of them, for bringing them into hell and dragging them out. He shifted his gaze out the door again, catching sight of the A-10 looping high above, a lone guardian silhouetted against the moon. Its engines rumbled deep, steady, a promise of protection even in the darkest skies. Hawkins' chest tightened with respect, even reverence. That ugly beast, mocked by some as too slow, too outdated, was the only reason they were still breathing. He keyed the mic one more time. Hog 1 Viper Actual. We owe you everything. The pilot's voice came back calm, edged with dry humor. Don't sweat it, Viper. You just focus on keeping your guys alive. I'll keep the wolves off your tail. Hawkins let out a slow breath, nodding even though the pilot couldn't see. Copy that. We'll hold on. And with those words, he leaned back against the vibrating steel of the bird, eyes locked on the night sky, knowing their survival still hinged on the roar of the warthog above. The firefight showed no signs of easing, and every man in the SEAL team knew they were standing on the knife's edge. The canyon that had offered them cover minutes ago now felt like a coffin slowly sealing itself. Dust choked the air, rocks splintered under the relentless hail of enemy fire, and the constant rattle of AKs echoed off the stone walls with a violence that drilled into their skulls. They could hear the Taliban fighters shouting to each other in Pashto, moving positions trying to flank them, pressing closer like a tightening noose. Ortiz slammed a new magazine into his rifle, ducking as bullets hissed overhead, and shouted toward Ramirez, who was bleeding heavily from the leg. The medic was already at his side, working fast despite the chaos, his gloved hands moving with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed trauma under fire countless times. But no amount of training could change the fact that blood kept pumping out, staining the sand dark, and Ramirez's breaths grew shallow. The team was trapped, pinned between two cliffs, outnumbered, outgunned, and slowly being cut to pieces. When Murphy called over the radio again for close air support, his voice cracked with frustration, the static-filled answer confirming the worst: no air cover, at least not yet. For a long, agonizing second, silence seemed to settle inside every man's chest, as if the canyon itself was preparing to swallow them. Then came the sound, a faint, distant thunder building from the horizon, like a storm pushing through the desert sky. At first, some of them thought it was artillery or maybe another incoming mortar barrage, but it grew sharper, angrier, a mechanical scream that drilled straight through the battle's chaos. Ortiz froze, eyes widening, then broke into a wild grin even as he fired back toward the enemy. "That's no bird," he yelled hoarsely. "That's a warthog." The others heard it too now, the low, menacing growl of twin turbofans carrying an unmistakable beast. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, was a sound of salvation for men on the ground. It was built for moments exactly like this, when soldiers were trapped, dying, desperate, and in need of a guardian angel made of titanium and firepower. The SEALs, battered and bloodied, lifted their heads just enough to glimpse it skimming low over the ridge. The plane cut across the sky like a predator swooping in, its gray fuselage scarred with the wear of combat, its canopy reflecting the sun. For the Taliban fighters who had been pushing forward with shouts of victory, the sight froze them in their tracks. For the SEALs, hope roared louder than any weapon. The A-10 banked hard, dipping a wing as the pilot locked onto the enemy positions. Then the sound came, the one that soldiers described as the voice of God itself. The Ju-8 Avenger cannon spun up, and the air filled with the iconic earth-shaking BRRRT that turned stone into dust and men into shadows. A river of depleted uranium rounds poured into the canyon wall where insurgents had set up their firing nests, shredding through cover, chewing through boulders, sending shards and dust raining down. The ground trembled beneath the SEALs' boots, and the screams of their enemies were drowned out by the metallic roar. Whole positions vanished in sprays of dirt and fire, the canyon echoing with destruction. Murphy screamed into the comms to mark their own location with smoke, and Ortiz popped a canister, the purple haze drifting upward to keep the pilot from getting too close. The A-10 screamed by again, engines howling, trailing heat shimmer as it climbed, rolled, and banked for another pass. Enemy fighters broke from cover, panic rippling through their ranks. Some fired blindly into the sky, their bullets bouncing harmlessly off the Warthog's armored belly. Others tried to retreat down the canyon, but there was nowhere safe to run, not against a machine built to end them. The cannon roared again, and the canyon walls lit with sparks and fire as another line of insurgent positions was torn apart. The SEALs used the chaos to push forward, laying down disciplined bursts of fire, cutting down those who tried to regroup. They moved with renewed energy, driven by the monstrous symphony overhead. But the battle wasn't over. Farther down the canyon, a larger group of Taliban fighters was regrouping, setting up RPGs and heavy machine guns to take shots at the A-10. Murphy spotted the glint of a launcher, his stomach tightening with dread. He shouted into the comms, "They've got anti-air." The pilot must have caught it on his sensors as well because the Warthog dipped low, almost impossibly close to the canyon floor, and unleashed rockets that streaked into the ridge. The explosion shook the earth, a geyser of flame and rock erupting as the RPG crew was vaporized in an instant. Still, a stream of tracers lanced upward toward the A-10, the insurgents desperate to swat it from the sky. The SEALs poured fire into them, trying to cover their savior, their rifles barking in unison. The fight had turned, but it was far from safe. Ramirez groaned, slipping closer to unconsciousness, and Ortiz cursed as he dragged him further behind a boulder, refusing to let go of his brother. The medic worked with frantic speed, pressing more gauze, starting fluids, his eyes flicking upward each time the canyon thundered with another BRRT. The air stank of cordite, blood and smoke, the heat oppressive as flames licked the canyon walls. Murphy's voice steadied, issuing orders, repositioning his men, his leadership anchoring them even as adrenaline threatened to rip them apart. Above, the A-10 wheeled again, coming in from a different angle, its nose dropping as if the very earth had called it down to finish what it started. The insurgents had lost their momentum. Where minutes before they had surged forward with confidence, now they scattered like ants under a magnifying glass. The A-10 cut them down mercilessly, each burst of through water. Because you survived. Because you fought when all others fell. Because the weapon chose you. Lyra shook her head, trembling. I didn't choose any of this. I don't want to be part of your plan. The figure's gaze hardened. Choice is an illusion. You are already bound to us. The weapon reshaped you. Even now your body carries our mark. At its words, Lyra felt the hum of the rifle merge with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She dropped it in horror, but it clung to her hand as though fused to her flesh. Panic surged through her, but the figure raised a hand and the fear ebbed against her will, replaced by cold clarity. You stand at the threshold, it intoned. Join with us in ascent. Refuse and fade with the remnants of your kind. Lyra's knees buckled, her mind torn between terror and defiance. Images flashed across her vision, her squad's faces, the fires of the outpost, the raiders falling beneath her rifle, the phantom craft hovering like a watchful sentinel. She saw humanity's ruins, barren cities, and then a vision of stars unfolding, alien worlds teeming with light, endless horizons she could scarcely imagine. The figure extended its hand, light crackling around its fingers. Choose. Lyra's breath came ragged, sweat dripping beneath her visor. She wanted to turn and run, to escape the valley, the structure, the fate being forced upon her. But where would she go? The desert stretched endless and merciless, the raiders would return, her people were gone. Only this remained, this impossible choice. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached out, her fingers brushed the hand of light, and in that instant the world shattered into brilliance. The chamber dissolved, the walls and pods and vaulted ceiling collapsing into streams of data and fire, and she felt her body suspended in a void that was neither space nor time. Her skin burned with a sensation beyond pain, as though every atom of her being was being unraveled and rewritten simultaneously. She tried to scream but no sound came. Her voice was drowned in the thunder of voices that were not her own. Countless minds pressed against hers, echoes of the architects, the ones who had built this place, their thoughts flowing like rivers of fire and ice. They surged through her veins, their knowledge crashing into her consciousness in waves she could barely withstand. She saw stars born and die in bursts of unimaginable beauty. She saw civilizations rise and collapse, vast empires spanning galaxies falling into silence like sandcastles at the mercy of the tide. She saw humanity's brief flicker of existence, fragile and brutal, fighting endlessly against itself until nothing remained but ash and whispers. She wanted to let go, to tear herself free, but the weapon bound her like chains of fire, fusing her mind with theirs. Do not resist, the voices thundered. You are conduit. You are bridge. She shook her head violently, gasping against the current. I'm not your bridge. I'm just a soldier, I'm nothing. But the voices roared back, neither cruel nor kind, only absolute. You are chosen because you endure. The flood slowed, the brilliance dimmed, and she found herself standing once more on solid ground, though it was not the chamber she had entered. This was something far older, far larger. An endless hall stretched in all directions, lined with towering spires of crystal that pulsed with inner light. Above, a sky of shifting auroras rippled, stars bending and twisting in impossible constellations. Lyra clutched the rifle still fused to her hand and looked down at her body. Her armor was cracked, her skin glowing faintly with the same pattern she had seen on the pots, etched into her flesh as though branded by light itself. She staggered forward, disoriented, and the echoing steps of her boots reverberated like thunder. Ahead, at the center of the hall, stood a dais upon which rose a structure resembling both throne and machine, alive with energy. The holographic figure waited there, no longer translucent but solid, its presence radiating authority. "You stand within the archive," it said, its voice reverberating through her bones. "This is the nexus of our memory, the place where the past and future converge. You have touched our essence and in return we will touch yours." She wanted to spit defiance, to tell them she never asked for this, but the words caught in her throat. Somewhere deep inside, a spark of understanding flickered. This was more than conquest. This was survival, an inheritance passed not by blood but by fire. She stepped onto the dais and the figure reached toward her chest. Light seared through her body as vision struck her mind like lightning. She saw herself standing among alien stars, leading fleets of vessels unlike anything humanity had ever built. She saw her voice commanding both human and architect alike, bridging two species into one. She saw herself as both savior and destroyer, her choices carving futures out of stone. Then the visions turned darker. She saw her face twisted in rage, planets burning under her command, her weapon striking down friend and foe alike as she gave in to the same endless cycle that had destroyed humanity. She saw herself enthroned in power, alone, the last echo of her kind, a tyrant wearing the mask of destiny. The figure's voice pierced through the storm. "This is the choice. You may wield the archive to guide your kind beyond extinction, or you may consume it as so many before have done. You are bridge but you are also blade." Lyra's chest heaved, sweat dripping as her knees threatened to buckle. Her mind raced back through her life, the squadmates who had died screaming, the children she had seen starve in ruined towns, the raiders who carved joy from others' suffering. Humanity had destroyed itself long before this valley, long before she picked up the rifle. Could she really guide what was left of it to something better? Or would she simply repeat the same cycle on a grander scale? Her grip tightened on the rifle. The weapon pulsed like a living thing waiting for her decision. "I don't want to be your god," she whispered, voice cracking. The figure tilted its head. "Nor do we ask it. We ask only that you carry the archive forward, into a future that is no longer ours." She lowered her head, trembling. The weight was unbearable, but she knew now there was no escape. To reject this would mean to fade into dust, the last human wandering a wasteland until her bones joined the desert. To accept meant to carry a burden greater than any war, greater than any grief she had ever known. Slowly, she raised her head, her eyes burning with a fierce resolve born not from destiny but from defiance. "Then I'll carry it," she said, voice steady at last. "But I carry it my way, not as your weapon, not as your tyrant. As myself." The figure regarded her silently, then bowed its head once. "So it is chosen." The hall erupted in light. The spires blazed, the auroras above ignited into cascading ribbons of fire, and the archive surged into her chest like a second heartbeat. She staggered but did not fall, her body trembling with new strength and terrible knowledge. The rifle dissolved into her arm, its patterns fusing with her veins, until it was no longer a weapon but a part of her very being. When the brilliance faded, she stood once more in the valley beneath the desert stars. The structure behind her was silent, its light extinguished, the pods dormant. The desert wind howled softly, carrying the scent of dust and ash. She looked up at the sky, vast and cold, and for the cannon fire tearing through their numbers, each missile slamming into their fortifications. The canyon that had seemed like a grave was now a killing field, for the enemy. The SEALs pressed forward with renewed purpose, their rifles cracking, their boots kicking up dust as they cleared position after position. They fought with a savage rhythm, covering each other, shouting over the chaos, their movements honed by years of training. The warthog above was their shield and sword, buying them the space to strike. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours, the battle stretching on, bodies littering the ground, smoke choking the sky. But slowly, steadily, the gunfire from the enemy began to fade. The last bursts of resistance were silenced beneath the combined wrath of SEAL rifles and the Avengers' thunder. When at last the canyon fell quiet again, the only sounds were the hiss of fire, the groans of the wounded, and the distant echo of the A-10 circling overhead, ensuring nothing was left standing. Murphy slumped against a rock, his rifle across his lap, sweat stinging his eyes as he looked at his team. They were alive, bloodied, exhausted but alive. He met Ortiz's gaze, then the medic's, then the pale, unconscious face of Ramirez. "We're not done," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We get him out. We all get out." Above them, the A-10 banked away, climbing into the burning sky like a steel angel fading into the heavens, leaving behind the silence of survival and the wreckage of enemies who had thought the SEALs finished, The roar of the A-10 still echoed across the valley like a ghostly drumbeat long after it disappeared beyond the ridge, but the SEALs had no time to linger in awe. They knew better than anyone that air support, no matter how devastating, was fleeting, and enemies had a way of crawling back out of the dust, regrouping, and striking with even more fury. Reyes was the first to snap them back into the present, his voice sharp, the tone of a man who had survived too many near-death ambushes. Check ammo, check each other, and get ready to move, we're not staying here. The men moved quickly, not wasting words, just instinctively falling into the rhythm of survival. Shell casings still smoldered on the dirt floor, the acrid scent of spent gunpowder mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Jackson knelt by Torres, whose side was wrapped hastily in gauze that was already stained crimson. "You good?" Jackson muttered, his eyes scanning the bandage. Torres grimaced, biting back a groan, and forced out a terse, "Good enough." In truth, he was pale, sweat slicking his forehead, but SEALs knew that words like, "good enough," had to mean something in a fight. Kane slapped a fresh mag into his rifle, eyes narrowed toward the ridgeline. "They'll be back." That wasn't their whole force. Just a probe. They wanted to see how long we'd last without cover. Miller wiped grime from his face, the lines of exhaustion stark beneath his eyes, but when he looked at Reyes, his expression carried a grim steadiness. Then they got their answer. Reyes nodded, the faintest flicker of a smirk tugging his lips, but there was no humor behind it, just calculation. He pulled out the map from his vest, unfolding it against the ground, and the men crouched around him, heads close, weapons still angled outward in case shadows shifted where they shouldn't. "We're here," Reyes said, stabbing a gloved finger at their current location near the bend of a dry riverbed. "Our exfil is still 5 clicks west. If we sit here, they'll pin us in when reinforcements arrive. We move fast, stay low, and pray that bird circles back for another pass." Kane glanced toward the horizon, the sky painted with streaks of fire as the sun slid lower, bleeding into the jagged peaks. "And if it doesn't?" Reyes folded the map and tucked it back into his vest. His eyes swept over his men, the weight of responsibility heavy but never wavering. "Then we do what we came here to do. We finish the mission and we walk out together." The mission. It was the unspoken anchor keeping them upright even as adrenaline began to ebb and fatigue threatened to drag them down. Intel had suggested that the valley housed a weapons cache feeding insurgent fighters across the region, and the SEALs were tasked with locating and marking it for airstrike. They hadn't expected the hornet's nest they stirred, but now that they were here with blood spilled and enemies swarming, failure wasn't an option. Jackson adjusted his radio, trying again to raise command, static answering him with a cruel hiss. "Still nothing," he said. "Either we're jammed or out of range." Reyes didn't waste breath cursing. "We move anyway. Single file, spread out. Kane, you're on point. Miller, rear guard. Keep Torres in the middle. We move now." The SEALs rose, weapons up, eyes scanning every shadow as they began their cautious march. The valley that had moments before felt like a cage of gunfire now felt eerily quiet, too quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath. Every rock, every broken wall, every cluster of scrub brush looked like it could conceal the barrel of a rifle. Kane led them with deliberate precision, his boots placing each step as if he expected the ground to betray him. They weaved through jagged terrain, cutting across the dry riverbed where their footprints would be harder to track. The silence stretched, broken only by the rasp of breath and the soft metallic clicks of gear shifting with movement. Hours in combat had taught them that silence wasn't peace, it was often the cruelest warning. Torres stumbled once, knees buckling, and Jackson caught him with a hand to the shoulder, steadying him without a word. Torres gave a curt nod of thanks, his jaw set in determination, refusing to be the weak link, even as blood seeped slowly beneath the gauze. As they climbed toward higher ground, Reyes signaled a halt. The men dropped low, bodies pressed against rock and dirt, as the distant rumble of engines drifted toward them. Kane adjusted his night vision goggles, eyes narrowing. Through the green hue, he saw headlights cresting the far ridge, a convoy of technicals crawling like metal insects across the landscape. "We've got company," he whispered into comms. Reyes' mind raced. The enemy was moving fast, sweeping the valley, likely searching for survivors after the A-10's devastation. If the convoy reached the riverbed, they'd find the SEALs' trail. Reyes studied the terrain, options flickering like a deadly chess game. "We can't outrun vehicles uphill," he said quietly. "We'll ambush them, thin their numbers, and break contact before they regroup. Miller, set up your saw covering that choke point. Kane, claymores on the ridge line. Jackson, get Torres into position with his rifle. He may be hurt, but his eyes are still sharp. The men moved quickly, silent efficiency born of years of drills and countless missions. Kane set the claymores with practiced hands, angling them toward the narrow bend where the convoy would be forced to funnel. Miller unfolded the bipod of his saw, his barrel trained down the slope, finger resting on the trigger guard with hungry patience. Jackson helped Torres settle into a prone position behind cover, handing him a fresh mag. Torres nodded, biting down pain, steadying his breathing. The headlights grew closer, the growl of engines louder, dust plumes curling into the darkening sky. Reyes watched, counting vehicles, gauging spacing, reading the rhythm of their approach like a predator. Studying prey. Then, with a flick of his hand, the valley erupted. Claymores detonated with a thunderclap, spraying fire and shrapnel into the lead vehicles. Tires shredded, metal twisted, and men screamed as chaos swallowed the convoy. Miller opened up with the saw, his gun barking thunder into the night, tracers stitching across trucks and bodies. Kane's rifle cracked in precise rhythm, every shot placed with surgical precision. Jackson fired beside him, his rounds punching through windshields, toppling silhouettes before they could return fire. Torres, despite his injury, squeezed the trigger with deadly calm, his shots finding targets even as blood seeped into the dust beneath him. The enemy scrambled, shouting orders, some firing wildly into the dark. But the SEALs had chosen their ground, and for those first brutal minutes, it was a slaughter. Still, numbers pressed back like an unrelenting tide. Rockets streaked overhead, exploding against the rocks, showering shards across the SEALs' position. Bullets hammered the ridge, forcing heads down, chipping stone into razor fragments. Reyes barked orders over comms, shifting fire, controlling the tempo of the fight with a commander's precision. Short bursts, conserve ammo, keep them pinned, he shouted. The SEALs held, but every man knew the truth. Ammo was running low and reinforcements were surely not far behind. Reyes felt the weight of time like a vice closing on his chest. He risked a glance upward, the sky now deep black, scattered with stars. Somewhere out there, maybe the A-10 was circling, maybe another bird was inbound, maybe salvation still roared in the darkness. Or maybe they were alone, backs to the wall, fighting with nothing but grit and steel. He clenched his jaw, forcing away doubt. "We hold this line," he told his men, voice steady despite the storm around them. "No matter what comes, we hold." And as the enemy regrouped, charging into the firestorm with renewed fury, the SEALs did just that, a band of brothers locked in the crucible of war, waiting for either death or the thunder of salvation to find them once more. The smoke from the last strafing run still hung in the air like a curtain of fire and ash, drifting low across the valley as the SEALs crouched in the mud, their ears ringing and their hearts pounding against their ribs. The A-10 had bought them time, shredding enemy positions and giving them room to breathe, but as the echoes of its cannon faded into the mountains, reality slammed back hard. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. More enemy fighters were regrouping at the treeline, their shouts rising like a storm, and the SEALs knew that without cover they would be overrun within minutes. Harris spat into the dirt, his voice hoarse as he barked orders, trying to sound steadier than he felt. They had wounded to move, ammunition running low, and the extraction point still 2 clicks away over rough terrain that was now crawling with hostile fighters. Every instinct screamed at them to move, but movement meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Still, sitting tight was suicide, so Harris made the call. They would push for the ridge, dragging the injured with them, and pray the A-10 circled back before the valley became their grave. Torres slung his rifle and hoisted Mason onto his shoulder despite the blood soaking through both their uniforms, Mason groaning but keeping silent, his teeth grit against the pain. Every man carried more weight than he thought possible, gear, weapons, wounded brothers, but no one hesitated. They advanced through the brush in staggered formation, every eye scanning for movement, every ear tuned to the thud of boots in the dirt behind them. The enemy had the numbers, the terrain, and home advantage, but the SEALs had discipline and the kind of stubborn will that only came from knowing that the man next to you would rather die than let you fall alone. They crossed a shallow stream, boots splashing in water that glittered under the moon, and Harris felt the night closing in on them, shadows shifting with every gust of wind. He raised a fist, signaling a halt as the crack of a rifle echoed from the ridge. Bullets hissed past, smacking into the rocks around them, and the team dropped low, weapons up, returning fire in controlled bursts. The firefight lit the night in sharp stabs of orange, the air filling with the acrid tang of gunpowder and the wet thud of rounds hitting flesh. An enemy fighter screamed and fell from the ridge, but more voices rose behind him, a wave waiting to crash down. "Move!" Harris snarled, firing uphill as Torres and Blake dragged Mason behind cover. The SEALs bounded forward in pairs, one group laying down suppressive fire while the other advanced, inching their way toward the ridge with deadly precision. Sweat stung Harris's eyes despite the chill of the mountain air, his throat raw from shouting orders. Every second felt like borrowed time, every step like a gamble against impossible odds. The enemy pressed harder, pushing down the slope, their muzzle flashes flickering like fireflies of death, and Harris knew they couldn't hold this dance forever. He prayed for the sound of jet engines, for the roar of salvation, but the sky above was empty, only stars and the faint arc of the moon watching their struggle. Just when the weight threatened to break him, Blake's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and fierce. "We're SEALs, damn it. They bleed like we do." The team roared in answer, surging forward with renewed fury, their rifles barking fire and lead as they clawed their way up the slope. The ridge was a meat grinder, stone and blood and fire all mixed into one nightmare battlefield. Harris vaulted a boulder, dropping 2 fighters with quick, clean shots, then rolled into cover as a grenade detonated nearby, showering him with dirt and shrapnel that tore a groove through his vest but missed flesh by inches. Torres grunted as a round nicked his arm, but he didn't slow, mowing down a line of enemies with short bursts that chewed through brush and bone alike. Mason, half-conscious, whispered something incoherent, clutching at Torres's vest like a child in a storm. The SEALs pushed higher, step by brutal step, until they crested the ridge at last, lungs burning and magazines nearly empty. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, the night still except for the faint crackle of fire from burning trees below. Then the enemy surged again, this time from the far side, their silhouettes spilling from the treeline like ants, countless and relentless. Harris felt despair claw at the edge of his mind, but he shoved it down, forcing his focus on the next shot, the next command, the next breath. They would not break, not here, not tonight. "Hold the line," he roared, his voice raw but steady, and the SEALs obeyed, planting themselves like stones in a river, their rifles snapping fire in disciplined rhythm. Enemies fell, but still more came, and the ridge became a hellscape of smoke and bodies, the air thick with screams and gunfire. Blake ran dry, switching to his pistol without missing a beat, dropping 2 men before slamming an empty mag against a rock with a curse. Torres handed him a spare without a word, reloading with one hand while dragging Mason deeper into cover with the other. The fight stretched into eternity, each second a war of its own, until Harris began to wonder if this ridge would be the last thing he ever saw. And then, like a ghost, the sky answered. The faint whine at first, barely heard over the chaos, then rising, growing, swelling into the unmistakable thunder of twin engines. The SEALs froze for a heartbeat, hope flaring like fire in their chests, before Harris shouted the word that carried through every man's soul, "Eten." The enemy didn't hear it, or if they did, they didn't understand until it was too late. The scream of the G8 cannon tore the night open, a sound like the earth itself splitting, and fire rained down from above. The ridge shook under the fury of the Warthog's guns, lines of tracers stitching through the treeline, shredding everything in their path. Enemy fighters vanished in fountains of dirt and blood, their attack collapsing in an instant under the onslaught. The SEALs hunkered low, shielding their ears from the thunder, but their hearts soared with the roar, salvation writ in steel and fire. The Warthog made pass after pass, each run carving swathes through enemy ranks, each burst of cannon fire a hammer blow against the tide. Harris could feel the ground tremble with every strike, the heat of explosions washing over his skin. He peeked from cover to see the valley below transformed into a wasteland of smoke and fire, the once endless swarm of enemies now scattering like leaves in a storm. The A-10 circled wide, its silhouette a dark angel against the stars, then roared back in with a vengeance that shook the mountains. The SEALs hooped and hollered, their voices breaking with relief and triumph, but they didn't waste the gift. They reloaded, regrouped, and prepared to move, knowing the Warthog's fury was their window to escape. When the A-10 finally pulled high, banking toward the horizon, silence rolled in, heavy and absolute, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of fire. Harris rose slowly, his body aching, his gear torn and bloodied, but his spirit unbroken. He looked at his men, exhausted, battered but alive, and felt a swell of pride so fierce it nearly dropped him to his knees. They had faced the impossible and held, not by luck, not by chance, but by sheer will and the bond of brothers who refused to let one another fall. He raised his rifle skyward in silent salute to the A-10, their unseen guardian, then turned to his team with a single command, steady and certain, "We move." And together, under the watch of a scarred moon, they pushed on, Not as victims of war but as survivors who had clawed their way through hell itself and come out standing. The ridge they had bled for was behind them now, but the night was far from forgiving. Every step forward was a battle against exhaustion, pain, and the weight of men they refused to leave behind. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow, his face pale beneath the moonlight as Torres carried him like a brother, refusing to yield despite the blood soaking his sleeve and the throbbing wound in his arm. Harris led them through the jagged terrain, eyes scanning constantly, ears straining for the telltale crack of rifles or the rumble of engines. They had won the last round, saved by the A-10's fury, but they all knew the enemy wasn't finished. The Taliban fought like the mountains themselves, endless, unyielding, and patient. Harris didn't let his men dwell on it. "Stay sharp," he whispered over comms. "We're ghosts now. We move fast, we move quiet, and we don't stop until the exfil sight." His voice was steady, and that steadiness was what kept the others moving, one foot after the other, even when their bodies begged them to collapse. The valley stretched before them like a shadowed labyrinth, jagged cliffs rising like black teeth against the starlit sky, every echo of the wind carrying the ghost of battle. They moved through it like wraiths, weapons up, boots rolling heel to toe to mute their steps, their breath fogging faintly in the chill. The silence was oppressive, the kind that pressed on the eardrums and made the imagination see shapes in every shadow. Blake swore softly under his breath when he thought he saw movement near the ridgeline, but Harris raised a hand, steady and calm. They froze in place, crouching low, waiting. Moments dragged, the night stretching thin, until a goat wandered into view, bleating softly as it clambered down the rocks. Relief rippled through them in tight smiles, but no one laughed. There wasn't room for laughter out here. They moved on. Hours felt like days. The weight of gear cut into shoulders, every muscle screaming, every joint grinding. Torres stumbled once, nearly pitching forward with Mason, but Blake was there instantly, bracing him, keeping them both upright. "I've got you," Blake muttered, and Torres gave him a grateful glance, though words felt like luxuries they couldn't afford. Their silence wasn't just tactical, it was survival, and survival demanded focus. The moon dipped lower, shadows stretching longer, the horizon beginning to lighten with the faintest promise of dawn. Harris kept them on course, checking the stars, his compass, the jagged outlines of peaks he had memorized from satellite imagery. Every landmark told him they were closer, but the weight in his gut told him danger walked with them. When dawn finally brushed pale light over the mountains, it revealed the scars of battle all around, burnt-out vehicles, bloodstains drying on rocks, twisted metal jutting like bones from the earth. They weren't the only ones who had paid a price here. Harris crouched, raising a fist, signaling a halt. The team dropped low, instincts firing as his eyes narrowed on the horizon. A glint of light, too sharp, too deliberate. Blast. A scope. The sniper's shot cracked before Harris could shout. The round slammed into the dirt inches from Kane's face, spraying grit and shards. The SEALs scattered for cover, rolling behind rocks as the echo rolled across the valley. "Contact East Ridge." Harris barked, his rifle already up, scanning. Another shot whined overhead, ricocheting off stone. The sniper was skilled, disciplined, taking measured shots to pin them, not waste ammo. "Find him," Harris growled. Jackson spotted the shimmer first, glass catching morning light again, and called it out. Blake steadied his rifle, breath held, body still, fingers squeezing until his shot cracked through the silence. A figure tumbled down the ridge, rifle clattering. The sniper was finished. But Harris knew better than to think he was alone. A moment later, gunfire erupted from the ridgeline, a squad of fighters spilling from cover, their shouts rising like a war cry. The SEALs returned fire instantly, their rifles barking controlled bursts, tracers streaking through the pale dawn. Dust and smoke rose, the air filling again with the chorus of battle. Torres, despite the weight of Mason and his own wound, braced against a rock and fired one-handed, his shot steady, every pull of the trigger a defiance of pain. Blake laid down covering fire, shouting for Kane to flank left. Harris shifted his men like pieces on a board, orchestrating the chaos into survival, calling targets, timing bursts. The enemy pressed hard, but the SEALs' discipline held, their fire chewing through attackers, dropping them one by one. Still, for every body that fell, more seemed to rise from the rocks, a tide that wouldn't end. "We can't stay pinned here," Blake shouted, reloading with quick, efficient movements. Harris scanned the terrain, eyes flicking to a dry gulch running west. It was risky, open ground at first, but it could take them closer to exfil. "Smoke out. We move on my mark," Harris ordered. Kane yanked 2 canisters from his vest, popped them and tossed them downslope. Thick white plumes billowed upward, masking sight lines choking the air. "Move!" Harris roared, and the SEALs surged into the gulch, firing blind into the smoke as they withdrew. Bullets hissed past, snapping the air, but the cover held long enough for them to break contact. They sprinted down the gulch, boots pounding against hard earth, lungs heaving, Mason's limp form bouncing against Torres's shoulder. The gulch twisted and turned, the smoke thinning as they gained distance, but the sounds of pursuit echoed behind them. Shouts, gunfire, the relentless chase. Harris's chest burned, his throat raw, but he pushed harder, driving his men forward. Every step was agony, every muscle begging to quit, but quitting wasn't in their blood. They broke from the gulch into a wide plateau, the exfil ridge looming in the distance. Relief surged, but it was fleeting. The rumble of engines grew behind them, louder, closer. Technicals. Armed trucks. The Taliban weren't giving up. Dust plumes rose as vehicles crested the horizon, mounted guns swinging toward the plateau. Harris's stomach dropped. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no cover between here and the ridge. He raised his rifle anyway, teeth bared in defiance. "We make our stand here," he growled, and his men formed up beside him, battered, bloodied, but unbowed. They would not run. They would not break. The technicals roared closer, machine guns spitting fire, the air alive with tracers and death. The SEALs fired back, their rounds slamming into windshields, ripping through gunners, but the sheer volume of enemy fire was overwhelming. The plateau erupted in dust and flame, rounds kicking up earth, grenades thundering, the world collapsing into chaos again. Harris screamed over comms, calling every shot, every shift, his voice the anchor in the storm. Torres collapsed to one knee, blood pouring from his arm, Mason slipping dangerously close to stillness, but he kept firing, his teeth clenched, eyes burning with defiance. Blake dropped 2 more gunners before a round clipped his helmet, spinning him sideways, dazed but alive. Kane fired rockets from his launcher, one technical erupting in flame, another skidding to a halt in smoke, but more poured in to take their place. The SEALs were outnumbered, outgunned, standing on the edge of annihilation. And then, through the chaos, the sound came again, low at first, then rising, swelling, splitting the sky. The scream of turbines, the thunder of wings. The Warthog was back. The A-10 burst over the ridge like a beast unleashed, sunlight glinting off its scarred armor, its nose dropping as it bore down on the technicals. The Ju-8 cannon spun up, the earth-shaking BRI ripping the plateau apart as rounds tore through vehicles, shredding metal and men alike. Fire erupted, explosions rocking the ground, the enemy charge disintegrating in a storm of steel. The SEALs whooped and roared, their voices hoarse but fierce, as salvation screamed above them once more. The A-10 banked, circled, and dove again, missiles streaking into the convoy, detonations lighting the dawn like the wrath of gods. The Taliban broke, fleeing into the mountains, their will shattered. Smoke and fire consumed the plateau, silence settling after the last roar of the cannon. Harris lowered his rifle slowly, his arms trembling with exhaustion, his chest heaving. Around him, his men staggered to their feet, bloodied but alive, their eyes fixed on the steel angels circling overhead. For the first time in hours, hope felt real. They had survived again, not by chance, not by luck, but by grit, brotherhood, and the thunderous salvation of a warthog that refused to let them die. Harris keyed his calm, voice rough but steady. "We hold until the bird takes us out. Nobody quits. Nobody falls. We're going home." The plateau was littered with burning wreckage, the air thick with the stench of smoke, gunpowder, and blood. The A-10 circled overhead like a guardian angel, its engines roaring low and steady, daring any enemy survivors to make a move. The SEALs crouched in the rubble, every breath ragged, every limb shaking with exhaustion but alive. Harris leaned against a scorched rock, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. None came. The Taliban had broken, scattered like dry leaves in a storm, their will shattered by the fury of the Warthog's cannon. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting, survival wasn't enough. They still had to get out. He keyed his comm, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Reaper 1, this is Phantom Actual. Plateau is clear. We need immediate exfil." Static hissed, then the calm voice of the A-10 pilot answered, "Copy, Phantom. Bird is inbound, 20 mics. Hold your position, keep your heads down. We've got your 6. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. 20 minutes. It might as well have been 20 years, but it was hope, and hope was something they had fought too hard to abandon now. He looked at his men, bloodied, battered, but standing. Blake was reloading mechanically, his hands moving despite the tremor in them. Torres still clutched Mason, who was frighteningly pale, his breathing shallow but present. Kane wiped blood from his temple, eyes scanning the burning wrecks as though daring them to move. Jackson sat slumped against a boulder, his face gray with fatigue, but when Harris met his gaze, the young SEAL gave a tight nod. They were alive and they weren't done yet. The minutes dragged. Every gust of wind carried the fear of an ambush, every flicker of shadow tugged nerves taut. Harris forced them into a defensive perimeter, rifles outward, eyes vigilant. "Nobody relaxes," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "We've come too far to get sloppy now." The men obeyed, forming a circle of steel around their wounded. Torres whispered encouragement to Mason, promising him a cold beer when they got home, promising him anything to keep him tethered to life. Blake muttered under his breath, counting ammo, as though the numbers kept his mind from breaking under the strain. Harris kept his focus outward, but inside the weight pressed heavy. He thought of the men who hadn't made it, of the ambushes survived, of the countless close calls where death had brushed so close it burned. He thought of the warthog overhead, of the faceless pilot who had become their lifeline, the line between life and death. He wondered if that man knew what he had saved here, not just soldiers but brothers, each of them carrying the lives of the others on their shoulders. Dust rose on the horizon. Harris stiffened, rifle raised, heart hammering, until the distinct sound of rotor blades split the air. Relief surged through them as two Black Hawks thundered over the ridgeline, rotors chopping the sky, the insignia of salvation emblazoned on their sides. "Birds are here," Blake shouted, his voice raw with relief. The helicopters banked low, one circling wide to provide cover, the other flaring for a landing amid the smoke and wreckage. The ground whipped into a frenzy of dust and debris, the deafening roar of engines drowning out thought. Harris waved his men forward, urgency cutting through the exhaustion. "Move, move, move. Get the wounded on first." They sprinted, dragging each other, half falling, half running, weapons clutched tight. Torres stumbled, Mason limp on his shoulder, but Blake and Kane caught him, hauling them both into the waiting Black Hawk. Jackson collapsed onto the deck, hands fumbling to secure Mason as medics swarmed, plugging lines, shouting over the din. Harris was the last to board, pausing at the ramp, scanning the burning plateau one last time. The bodies, the wreckage, the fire, all markers of a battlefield that would be forgotten by the world but carved into their souls forever. Then he climbed in, slamming a hand on the crew chief's shoulder. "We're good, take us up." The Black Hawk lifted, the earth falling away beneath them, the battlefield shrinking to a scar in the vast expanse of mountains. As they rose, the A-10 dipped its wings in salute, a silent farewell between warriors. The SEALs watched it vanish into the horizon, its mission complete, its presence etched into their memory like a brand. The adrenaline drained away, leaving only silence, the hum of rotors and the shallow breaths of the living. Harris slumped against the wall of the bird, his rifle across his lap, his eyes closing for the first time in what felt like years. He felt the weight of survival pressing down, heavier than death, but he also felt pride in his men, in their defiance, in their refusal to break. The medics worked feverishly on Mason, their hands steady, their voices calm despite the chaos still ringing in everyone's ears. Torres hovered close, his face twisted in silent prayer, his hand never leaving his brother's shoulder. Blake stared out the open door, eyes fixed on the receding battlefield, his jaw clenched, his thoughts unspoken. Kane sat with his head bowed, arms resting on his knees, blood dripping steadily from a cut he hadn't bothered to bandage. Jackson leaned back, his lips moving silently, perhaps counting again, perhaps whispering a name. Harris opened his eyes, looking at each of them, seeing not just soldiers but men who had walked through fire and refused to burn. They had lost blood, sweat, pieces of themselves they might never reclaim, but they had not lost each other. That was what mattered. That was why they fought. The helicopter roared on, carrying them away from the hell that had nearly claimed them, toward safety, toward home. None of them spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of exhaustion, of promises unspoken but understood. Promises to honor the fallen, to live for them, to carry the weight of survival together. Hours later, when the helicopters finally touched down at the forward operating base, the SEALs stumbled into the blinding sun, battered but unbroken. Medics swarmed, commanders barked questions, but Harris waved them off, his eyes only on his men. Torres staggered beside the stretcher carrying Mason, refusing to let go until the doctors physically pulled him away. Blake sat heavily on a crate, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a ghost. Kane walked straight to the armory, his face unreadable, his movements automatic, like a machine that didn't know how to stop. Jackson collapsed on the tarmac, staring up at the sky, as though trying to memorize the shape of the clouds. Harris stood in the middle of it all, silent, his chest heaving, his mind replaying the roar of the warthog, the sight of its fire tearing salvation into the earth. He knew the war wasn't over. There would be more missions, more battles, more nights when death would breathe down their necks. But he also knew something else, that they would never forget the sound that saved them, the scream of an A-10 ripping through the sky when all hope seemed lost. That memory would carry them through the darkest nights, a reminder that even in the valley of death, salvation could come screaming from the heavens. And as the base settled around them, as medics carried Mason away and commanders debriefed and mechanics fueled birds for the next fight, Harris stood tall, his voice quiet but unyielding as he whispered to himself and to the brothers who had fought beside him. Air cover's gone, they said, but then the A-10 screamed in and opened fire. "Dan,